You are listening to eRadio Show
by Missed Apex. We are elected.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the eRadio Show. I'm your host, Matt Trumpets, and today's episode is called Is It Just Me, or Is It Getting Chilly Outside? Joining me today is everybody's favorite guest and journalist extraordinaire, Chris _Stevens. How we doing there, Mr. Chris?
Yeah, I'm doing just great, Matt. I'm looking forward to watching the new Santiago race, of course, on a new venue where it is very much not chilly outside at the moment. Of course, peak of summer in the southern hemisphere.
Yes, well, then perhaps we can talk about tires and temperatures in a little bit. But first, I need to remind everyone, we are an independent podcast hosted by MissedApexPodcast.com, bringing you race reviews, news from the paddock, and tech analysis. We live stream our race reviews, so be sure to subscribe to eRadio Show on YouTube so you get a notification when we go live, so you can join our live chat room as well. And I guess there's really nothing to it. Perhaps we should head straight for the big, dirty news.
Big Dirty News.
And in this case, the big dirty news is we've got another E-Prix. Finally, we're going to be establishing some narrative continuity from race to race. It's very, very exciting.
Yeah, just to bring you up to speed on what happened in the previous race. Of course, if you want the full details, go and check out our Marrakesh race review, where we go right into detail with the race. But of course, it was pretty bonkers out there, wasn't it? With the two BMWs coming together, Verne clattering into Bird at the start of the race, and Jerome D'Ambrosio coming in to take victory and the championship lead going into this brand new circuit and a brand new venue in Santiago. Of course, last season, great track. Unfortunately, didn't go down so well with the locals. Now it's being held on more private land. It's being held in a park, a bit like it was in London, like Battersea Park. So hopefully that means there'll be fewer complaints and the locals will be a bit more happy about it. And I got to say, I really like the track design.
Okay, but I mean, Battersea hardly wound up working out well when push came to shove. Is there a reason we think this might work out better in Santiago? Will there be less complaints? Is the park perhaps a little more isolated from the rest of the city?
So Formula E gets a lot of flack for what goes down between the locals. I don't know if isolated is the right word, but it's not. It's less so on the streets. It's a bit less in your face and should cause a little bit less disruption to the city overall. But Formula E can always do, it will do whatever it can to inform the right people that, yes, okay, this is happening. We've done our part. The race has been agreed, but it's not down to Formula E to inform the locals of what is happening. And 99% of the time when the locals take issue with it, it's because they didn't know it was happening. But that's down to the local authorities and the local governments to deal with that. So Formula E ends up putting in an awful lot more effort and going beyond the things that it normally would do or other racing series would do to inform of a race happening, just to make sure that people are well informed. So they say they learned from what happened in Santiago last year, and they're going above and beyond to make sure that there are no complaints about this one.
That's excellent news, and I look forward to seeing what it is they feel will be appropriate for this venue. But you mentioned a new track layout. What is it about the layout that you like compared to last year's?
Well, I mean, last year's was great, wasn't it? It was a good track, and we saw a great race from it as well. But this new one, I think it works for Gen 2. I like the fact that it's kind of almost got that oval section to it with a little chicane in the middle. That chicane, by the way, very, very tight. That is that's some season 1, stuff that they've installed there, which I'm sure is not going to go down too well with the drivers. And honestly, I would have thought with Gen 2 we'd be seeing a bit less of that, but I don't know, who knows, they might change it for next year. Of course, we're still learning with the Gen 2 car, but overall the track looks really, really good. The end of the lap as well, those nice couple of hairpins as well, that's going to provide some good overtaking opportunities.
So with that in mind, do we think then that we will be looking at possibly some new and different teams in contention? Because it sounds like quite a different layout to what we've seen in the first two races.
Yeah, definitely. Well, this track is different to the first two races in that it's kind of the first proper street track that we've been to. Marrakesh, of course, semi-permanent facility. Diriyah, we couldn't really read into that, and also, the where they were racing in Diriyah, very, very unlike most Formula E venues. But then even here, there's a caveat because the track surface is a combination of tarmac and concrete, much like it is at Tempelhof in Berlin. So that means we're going to be seeing some increased tire wear. And of course, I know you love to talk about tires, Matt. And the third generation Michelin tire is the quickest wearing one that Michelin has introduced so far. So we could see that come into play at some point.
I would be delighted to see having to deal with tires be a part of what the drivers have to manage. I mean, that is part of your skill as a driver. Can I manage these tires under different circumstances? And quite frankly, a change in surface always seems to open up possibilities for different teams and for different drivers. I think it's going to be very, very tricky to manage. Do you have an idea of what temperatures we'll be looking at for the race?
It's going to be the hottest race we've seen this season, for sure. For sure. So this is going to be the first one where they're really going to have to manage the battery temperatures as well. Now, we know that with the new McLaren battery, it's got a higher threshold than the old Williams battery for overheating. It's now 80 degrees as opposed to 60 degrees for the battery temperature. But, we're in the middle of a crowded city at the peak of summer over there. So I'm sure we are going to be seeing that take more of an effect than we have done so far this season. But just to kind of finish up on the tires, I'm going to be fascinated to see what teams take what approach in terms of their tire usage, because you get two sets of tires per car. Now, of course, you used to get two on each car. Now you get two for your one car. Now that we're down to that one car, we've seen different teams take different approaches in the races so far in terms of when do you introduce your new tire? Do you start your race on your scrubbed set? Is that going to be better? Is that going to actually provide you a little bit more speed? That's going to vary from race to race. Here, we may see it's more necessary to start the race on a fresh set of tires. But I mean, just to give you an example, Diaz Techeetah on Verne's car, at least anyway, in Marrakesh, had used up both sets of its tires by the end of FP2 and were doing qualifying in the race on scrubbed sets. Now, in some cases, that's going to work to your advantage. In other cases, perhaps here, you'll want the newer set. The thing about the concrete as well is the big issue they had at Tempelhof, the first couple of years they ran there, was because the track surface is so rough that it's very, very hard to actually maintain 100% throttle all the way down the straight, because it's so bumpy and rough. You actually end up, the throttle actually kind of feathers a lot. It sort of hovers between 95 and 100%. And if you could keep it at 100% for longer, obviously you were going quicker and you were more competitive. And with a new Gen 2 car, we're suddenly back to square one with that issue. So they'll take everything they learned from the 3 years of running in Berlin and try and make that work here. But then, of course, you've also got to make it work on the tarmac surface as well. It's a good challenge that we haven't seen before.
Yeah, and it's also, I got to say, fascinating in terms of setup, because if you're dealing with bumps, then you're looking for your suspension to do one thing. But then again, with your tight turns and stuff like that, you're going to need it to be set up entirely differently. And with two different surfaces to manage, picking your compromise is really going to be incredibly challenging. It's going to be a very technically challenging weekend for the engineering side, I would have to say. And I think for the drivers as well, figuring out how to manage the transition between the surfaces and how best to manage the tire wear throughout the practices and race. It's really going to be fascinating to see who decides to do what. So I'm very much looking forward to this race for that reason.
I think we're going to see teams go in different directions. You'll see one team really nail the last sector, those final two hairpins. But then you'll get another team that's really, really good in the first sector, which is a little bit quicker and a little bit more flowing. Those long, continual left-handers. Of course, this track has also got the longest single turn in Formula E, that long turn level. What I talked about with that sort of oval-looking section, so as you come out the super tight chicane, you're just going left constantly, and I think that is maybe something that's going to add into the tire wear. You're just going to be putting constant temperature through one part of the tire. So again, we're going to be seeing something different and something new.
All right, different and new. And you said this is the first proper street circuit. So is this really, in some ways, the first race where we get a real look at how everybody is doing? Are we calling this our first real circuit for this season, or is that unfair to the two that we've already seen?
No, I don't think it's unfair to the two that we've seen. The thing is, I think there are so many races in Formula E now with a little caveat on them. Like Adira doesn't represent most of Formula E. Marrakesh is a semi-permanent facility. So is Mexico. This track is brand new, so we can't really compare to last year, and it's got a combination of different surfaces. There are so many different ones. Like it's going to be around, like by the time we get to Hong Kong and Sanya and Rome, and you start racing on quite similar circuits at that point. The first half of the season is just full of asterisks, basically. So you can't just sort of sit there and say, oh, well, that's not a representative race. Don't look too much into that one anymore. You've got to look at all of them now. You've got to be able to be quick on those normal FE circuits and all these other ones that we visit that aren't like FE circuits, because there are so many of them now.
Okay, so if I understand you correctly, really what we're saying at this point is the team that did well in Saudi Arabia and in Marrakesh that shows up here and is also at the sharp end, that's the team that we really need to start watching, because they are clearly on top of their setup and tires in a way that perhaps we will see other teams coming and going depending upon the circuit characteristics.
Well, of course, the two teams that have been consistently quick so far are BMW, Andretti, and DS Techeetah. So we know they're going to be fighting up the sharp end. But at least, those two teams that have been consistent, there are other teams that are yet to reach their potential and might do so in Santiago.
Ah, I see. So it sounds like you want to bring up Audi, perhaps. Now, is there anything about this circuit in terms of its characteristics and what we know about their powertrain from last year that might really bring them back into the mix?
Well, the thing I think about this, I think it's going to be quite a high energy consumption lap. I think efficiency is going to be really, really key here, like more so than others. So like Marrakesh, that is one of the more high energy consumption laps that we go to. Here I think is going to be much of the same in Santiago, because there's so much of it. It's just going from high speed into a slow corner and then back up to high speed and then back into a low speed corner again. You're going to be doing a lot of regenning on that, but you're also going to have to be doing a lot of lifting and coasting, and the straights are so long as well. So that's going to be really, really important. Again, I think that's going to play into the hands of the likes of the Techeetahs and the BMWs that we know have been very, very quick in race trim. I'll be so glad to see if we finally get a proper shootout between those two teams, because they haven't had a fair crack at it, on equal terms yet in the first two races. In terms of Audi, they need a clean weekend to see what they can finally do. Virgin Racing have sort of hinted, hey, this is what we can do with your powertrain, having had much less testing. So what can you guys do when you finally turn it up to 11, which hopefully is what we're going to see this weekend, because I think once you throw them all in there at their peak, it's going to be so close.
Right, and I'm sure Lucas de Grassi feels like he has something to prove after his loss in the Race of Champions as well.
Yeah, so I wasn't going to mention this.
But you knew I would.
Yeah, the esports. We could sit here and talk about how this means that esports is actually just as important as real sports, but I think if any of the listeners know me, they'll know I'll argue that case. So maybe we should save that for a different time.
No, we can save it for a different time. It was interesting to me to see somebody like that beat him, but to be fair, it's Race of Champions, and you look at the vehicle, I'm not entirely surprised. We have seen people who have the ability to cross over from esports into the real world and do well, but just because you do well at esports doesn't necessarily guarantee that. I think most reasonable people would have that position, but it was really talked about a lot on social media. And if I know anything about Lucas, is that he will take that very seriously and want to, I don't know, come up with a performance to put it out of everyone's heads as quickly as possible.
Lucas doesn't care about the socials so much. He's not Nelson.
All right, then, gauntlet thrown, I suppose. But let's talk about Mahindra. Now, last season, Mahindra sort of came out of nowhere, and they were just having a Cinderella season, and then it all fell apart for them. They won last week. It seemed to be a bit of luck for them to wind up where they did. Who would have really bet that the two teammates would have taken each other out with the end of the race that near in sight? But yet they did, and they won. Are they really, really up there with these teams we've been talking about? Do you think they can pull it off? Is the improvement there? Or is it just going to be a bit too much, and we'll see them every now and then when circumstances favor them?
So you'd have to say if the two BMW guys had not come together in Marrakesh, that Jerome D'Ambrosio would have 2 third places to start off his season, which is still very, very good. That's a strong start to a campaign, but I don't think he would have won. In the same way that Antonio probably wouldn't have won in Addiria if the two Techeetahs hadn't been given penalties. So again, we're looking at races being decided by your ability to know the car and also not throw away points with silly collisions. Now, one's a lot easier than the other to do, especially when you've got a new car. So there are times you have to know when to risk it and when not to. And that's what Robin Freint said after the race, actually. He said, the second place was more valuable to me than risking losing everything for the win on the final lap against your own. So to answer your question, I don't think Mahindra are in raw pace up there with Techeetah and BMW. To be honest, between Techeetah and BMW, I'm not even sure which of those two I put ahead. Probably the Techeetah. In terms of the actual race pace, I think they're quite close, but they need to improve the qualifying pace. I mean, if you look at what Jerome did in Marrakesh, 10th on the grid, and he had to come up a long way, and to get himself back up to third in the first place, it was helped a little bit by all the chaos at the start as well. I have to wonder how that race would have played out if all the contenders were still in there. The Jaguars and Buemi as well. Those three, we haven't seen their potential either. So you've got to throw them into the mix for the podium as well. I don't think they're quite there, but I think if they can sort out the qualifying pace and start the race higher up on the grid, they'll give a better challenge to those guys. Because if they're able to score podiums for where they're qualifying at the moment, then Lord knows what they can do if they can qualify a little bit higher.
Yeah, well, that makes sense. And you bring up the two teams that I really was going to ask about next, both Jaguar, because we saw them do well. Do you want me to pronounce it differently? I will. Jaguar. Feel better now, Mr. Britt. And Nissan, especially with Buemi, looked very well placed for podium or top 5 until, the race started, and then it all literally went rather sideways for him. Do we see them coming back? Have you seen any hints? Have you heard any whispers or rumors as to where they might really be relative to the Techeetahs and the BMWs? Or are we going to just be grasping at straws till they either have the opportunity and don't, or do?
Yes, it is very much Jaguar and Nissan, not Nissan, as I've heard some of your folks say. Where do they lie in the grid? They're the biggest question marks for me at the moment, because I think they have the potential to throw something down. Jaguar especially. They can win races. Mitch probably could have fought for the podium and maybe even the win had he not chucked it away in Superpole and started further down the grid, and then got himself caught up in all the start chaos. That's a domino effect. They've got to start hooking it up more, and Jaguar is just that team that is always so close yet so far, especially with Mitch. So they're another team that just needs to nail a weekend. They need a weekend like a Zurich, but in this instance where things don't suddenly start going wrong for them halfway through the race, and Mitch ends up, leaving the circuit early because he was too upset and didn't want to talk to the media while he was like that. So they need to do that. Nissan, I think, is a little bit. I'm a little less optimistic about them, purely because we know what Sebastian Buemi is capable of. If that car is not fighting at the front of the grid, then it's not capable of it. He is the guy who gets to the front of the field. He's just so good at Formula E. Like, it's unreal. He is Mr. Formula E. And at the moment, another French-speaking man is at risk of taking all of his points records and his pole records and his win records away from him in a DS Techeetah. So I'd have to say that car is not where they need it to be yet. Now, that's fair enough. It's Nissan's first season, but like they would have said, they've been tapping into Renault's resources about learning about Formula E. They had Nissan staff embedded in the team before the takeover happened anyway. So I'm struggling to think of reasons why that car is not where it needs to be. Purely, it isn't capable of it. But why? That's what I want to know.
That is a good question. Do you think it's something technical? Or, I mean, I had the sense last year that Renault was kind of coasting on what they had done the previous seasons rather than developing all the way to the end. And part of it might have been they knew they had the car coming. They knew they had the Nissan coming in to take over from them. But also, in a sense, Formula One really became their priority early on last season. And I don't want to say take their eye off the ball, but from a resource point of view, some of the people who might have been contributing more might have been looking elsewhere when it would have benefited them.
No, I would totally say they took their eye off the ball. Because, like you said, the Formula One project was more important. And, rightly so, to be honest. There's a lot more money in that. And they're also trying to close up a 1.5 second gap to the front of the field, whereas in Formula E they were the front of the field. The season they started taking their eye off the ball anyway, because once they were going into season 4, they didn't change much. They didn't change anything really. It was a few tweaks here and there. I mean, the car was really great last season, so it'll be great this season. And to be fair, what they delivered in terms of hardware was good because the Cheetah won the championship with it. So you can't really look at that. They knew Nissan were coming in, so they didn't need to, pour any extra resource or development into the Season 5 powertrain. Nissan were going to take over that. So you got to start looking at what Nissan are doing as newbies to the series and bringing in. Of course, they did have all those software issues at the beginning of testing, which was hugely compounded by the fact that they only had one car running, basically one driver there for 2 of the 3 days of testing. And they only got that software upgrade in to do what they really wanted it to do, like a week before the season started, where they had their 50-kilometer filming day to do, where you just kind of run the car up and down an airfield back and forth, and say, yep, software works, that was good, and then it was straight to Addiria. So I get the feeling that they are still very much working their way through and fine-tuning that car.
So they will have been grateful for the extra testing time they've had recently, and maybe we will begin to see some, fruits born from those endeavors.
Dude, all of those teams are going to be so grateful for the extra testing. Like I know we talk about how the manufacturers get 15 days of private testing, and what do they get in Formula One? Hardly anything.
Yeah.
You get 8 days of preseason testing in Barcelona, and that's about it. So Formula E is practically a luxury for manufacturers. But to learn a whole new car, not enough, nowhere near enough. And there's always going to be something you can learn more and more and more with such a big technical overhaul of the championship. Like I kept on saying in the build up to this season, forget everything you know about Formula E because it's all changed. And it was the same for the engineers and the mechanics as well in terms of learning this particular car. So they've got all the work to do. And like for some teams, it's more fine tuning. Audi, for example, and Virgin, their hardware there is fine. They just need to fine tune it and find those last few tenths of a second. That's also going to help them with efficiency, eh, increasing that efficiency in the race. Some teams, like Nissan, like Venturi as well, are going to want to work on the hardware because they've had so many issues in that area, Venturi especially. Most of the teams are going to be looking at the braking software. That's the biggest gain you can make at the moment. That's what Jake Hughes was telling me, that the GP3 race winner was testing for Neo in Marrakesh. He was saying, look, big thing we're focusing on is the brakes because there's just so many gains you can make with that because it's such a new system. There's so much time to be found there.
Okay, so that's an incredibly fascinating insight. You bring up Venturi, who I was going to ask about. Obviously, HWA are basically, they're just sort of, what would you say, kibitzing, for lack of a better word, trying to figure things out. So we're not as worried about them. But Venturi, Dragon, Neo, are these all teams that have hardware as well as software issues to solve? To get back up with the Cheetahs, to get back up with the BMWs, or is it, frankly, is it beyond the resource they have? Are they looking for top tens and just being consistent in the points to maximize their finish this season?
A combination of both. These are the three teams you'd have expected to struggle most, or the four teams, I should say, sorry, including HWA. They are, in terms of manufacturers, they're the smallest teams on the grid, really. They're not Nissan, they're not Audi, they're not DS. These are guys that come with big bucks, with big resources and big staff and big paychecks as well. So compare that to what these relatively small manufacturers have. It's so tough to beat them in what is probably the biggest development part of Formula E I can remember. There were obviously big performance differences when Formula E first opened up powertrain development, and everyone went their separate way. You had 2 gear, 3 gear, 4 gear, 5 gear, 1 motor, 2 motor, inverters up here, inverters down there, inverters around the back. Cooling system around here that used to loop up and down and do the thing and meet in the middle somewhere. Let's mount it this way. Let's mount it that way. All sorts of different crazy things. But now all the powertrain stuff is converging so much. It starts to come down to the smaller details. And I think the bigger manufacturers have just got a better chance of nailing than the smaller teams. Especially when you're already limited on development. And if I were to look at Venturi and Neo, I'd say they're the ones in biggest trouble because there are fundamental issues with those powertrains that are consistently bringing up reliability issues and performance issues. Dragon, I think they need to just kind of hit the nail on the head a little bit more. I'm surprised they've managed to kind of bring something in so well, but I think that they're in a way a little bit lucky that Venturi and Neo are struggling so much. It's really tough when you have such a competitive championship, because we think of podium contenders. You have BMW, DS, Audi, Virgin, Nissan, Mahindra. You've already got 6 teams capable of it. That's your top 12. So there's a Jaguar as well. There's always going to be somebody massively disappointed. And when you compare that lot to the likes of Dragon, Venturi, and Neo, it's so tough to compete with that you're lucky to get a top 14 at that point. So I don't want to say Formula E is becoming 2-tier, because it's not. That's kind of just blatantly false, I think. But it's getting harder for them to break that barrier. Especially for Venturi and Neo, I've got fundamental issues.
Right. Well, we can talk about their fundamental issues, but before we do, I'm just going to run this by you. In Formula One, it's a thing a lot of times where information and ideas will come not directly from the team. You'll have a technology center. You'll have sort of ideas you can pull from that don't necessarily get reflected on the balance sheet of the team, and has long been a source of contention when discussing things like budget caps. Now, DS, you told me, are running a brake system from a early 2000s rally car. And it's important to remember that we don't think necessarily of DS, at least over here, as being a big manufacturer. But really, when you say DS, what you mean is Citroën, don't you?
Formerly Citroën.
Formerly.
Yeah, it used to be a Citroën subdivision, and then back in 2015, I think it became its own part of the PSA group.
Right. But you're talking about a company with a long supply of file drawers to be pilfered for ideas. And it seems like to me this is where we're beginning to see the difference being made, is these corporations, these manufacturers with the wider resources, the longer history in motorsports, simply are able to start at a higher level because they have already these ideas sitting around somewhere. All they need is some clever intern to ferret them out and pass them on to the right engineer.
Yeah, exactly. And so why is it any wonder that we see of those big manufacturers, why are Nissan and Jaguar struggling the most? When was the last time Nissan had something successful in motorsport? Like before, it was factory-wise. Anyway, I know Nissan GTRs tend to run a Bathurst and stuff like that, but they're not factory outfits. So the last factory outfit that Nissan ran was their LMP1 program back in 2015, 16 with the front-wheel drive
15,
car.
I believe, yeah.
But yeah, 2015. What a great success that front-wheel drive racing car was. And Jaguar, they've been out of motorsport since they pulled out of F1 back in the end of 2004. So no wonder those guys are struggling more than say someone like Renault that really hit the ground running in Formula E, or a team like Mahindra that is very rich in EV technology in general and motorsport. So it's easy to see where those things come along. I mean, a team like Penske and Dragon, for example, where they don't have a manufacturer, they race in IndyCar. You get everything handed to you in IndyCar. Like not trying to just bin off the challenge of IndyCar, because at times I do quite enjoy it. But you have a stock chassis and two engines. It's down to the team element to make that work. And in a way, it's very similar in Formula E. But at some point, on a fundamental level, you have to create a fundamental part of that car. And if you don't have the experience and the high-end technical know-how of it, and when I say high-end, I mean the absolute peak, then it becomes very difficult.
Yeah, fair enough. Penske has the race team experience. I believe they have the engineering and the setup experience to do well. But what they don't have is a vast history of manufacturing and race car design and implementation to go looking through for ideas for their current scenario.
See, this is why like the teams like Mercedes and Porsche, when they come in next season, they're going to be able to hit the ground running a little bit better than the likes of Jaguar when they came in. Not least because, for example, they've had HWA running a team for a year already, but because they're already so well versed with EV technologies. They're both experienced with ERS systems, which is practically what a Formula E car is. And Mercedes are already partnering with the same people who handle the hybrid elements of their Formula One engine.
Yeah, and as an interesting side note, do you know what about that Nissan car made it do so poorly the year that it ran at Le Mans?
Well, it wasn't anything to do with the fact that it was front-wheel drive and it chewed up its front tires?
No. Well, that may have been part of it, but the real issue for them was they broke their hybrid drive in the first couple of hours and basically had to run without it the entire rest of the race. So it was the electrics that did them in.
Oh, well, that's really encouraging for a Formula E.
On the other hand, they put out the Leaf, so they got to know something about it, right?
But I feel bad because I feel like we're saying a lot of very negative things about Nissan so far in this show. I'm sure they will get there, but it doesn't surprise me that compared to the other teams, they're struggling a little bit. And frankly, for a first season in Formula E, they're doing okay. They're no worse than where Renault Edams were last season, albeit for very different reasons.
Yeah, fair enough. What say we move on, unless you have anything else you want to add, and look at a few listener questions before we are done with today's show.
Yeah, I like this. I'm glad we're doing this sort of little segment now because we're struggling to fill an hour's content. Let's be honest. So we did this for the season preview, and it worked really well. And so I think we're just going to keep doing it for every race preview. So before every show, hit us up on Twitter at eRadio Show and send in a few questions for the panel, and we'll answer that and fill up 10 minutes of showtime to give you a little bit more value for your money if you're on the Patreon fund, that is. So the top question I got, the first one was from Facebook. And there was a long essay that came with it, but the gist of it was, why can't Neo make an efficient car? It's a problem that has plagued the team's performance since season 3. Is it a fair point to blame the leadership or upper management in China because they're focusing on developing hypercars like the EP9 rather than improving the FE team? That's interesting, because you'll always hear teams like Renault, teams like Ferrari in Formula One say how they have to balance, the road car division and the motorsport division. I personally don't buy that because you're handling two completely separate divisions. And let's be honest, teams like Ferrari aren't short on a bit of cash to be able to split that. I think maybe for a team like Neo, a manufacturer like Neo, a relatively small one, it might play a little bit more of an element in it. But I think the biggest thing, first of all, I don't think it's fair to look at the leadership. Jerry Hughes is a great team principal, and that car has had issues beyond season 3. It wasn't good in season 2, back when the team was Next EV as well. The only reason, back when it was Team China Racing in season 1, they were really only winning races because of Nelson. Nelson was really great at energy management and was really, really strong in that first season, and really got on with Formula E very, very well. Since then, ever since it's been handed to the Neo or Next EV as a manufacturer to design the car, it's just gone wrong. I think most of the time that's been down to the twin motor layout, which of course they've now dropped. So you can't just say it's a heavy, inefficient car anymore. There's other issues with it. And as I mentioned earlier, there are fundamental issues with that car, especially in terms of reliability on both cars. And it keeps cropping up in testing as well. They just don't run because they can't get it to work properly. And it's really, really worrying at times. And really basic things as well, like Tom Dillman's brake failure in qualifying in Marrakesh that made him run into the two virgins in the pit lane. Jamie Chadwick, who tested in Algeria and Marrakesh, has barely gotten a lap in because the car will not run. So there are issues there. So it's a much more fundamental issue, and it's in the engineering, it's in the design. So it's not a management issue. In terms of being a well-run team, it's actually quite a well-run team. Save for the Dillman fiasco in qualifying in Algeria, where they just kept running him for laps and laps and laps. And I spoke to Jerry about it in Marrakesh, actually, and he said, yep, there was a message came from race control. We misinterpreted it because it was a bit vague. That was on us. And they're like, yeah, but look at that. You absorbed it. You learned from it. You implement a structure that means it won't happen again.
Yeah.
And that's good leadership.
So
it's fundamental.
So are you saying then this is almost entirely a hardware issue, or is it a combination of hardware and software? I mean, could this be thermal regulation? I mean, certainly with brakes, it could be a problem with the brake-by-wire software. Do we have a clue as to where this lies? Have you heard anything? Or do we just have to chalk it up to it's fundamentally the design of the car and not so much the running of the team?
It's the design of the car. The thing, because so many teams, like all bar 2 teams, so DS designed their own braking software. We think Mahindra were another one that did as well. Every other team bought the software from a company that made it for a Formula 1 team or an LMP1 team. So the software should be solid. In terms of maybe running it, there could be issues there, but I think it's much more likely the issues lie within the hardware and the actual design of the car.
Okay, fair enough. You bring up, we've been talking about brake-by-wire. I believe Justin from Twitter had a question about that and just would like you to re-explain all over again what the difference fundamentally is between the braking we normally talk about in a road car, let's say, and what we mean when we talk about brake-by-wire in a Formula E car for this new Generation 2 car.
Yeah, so it seems some people still don't understand it, which is fair enough because it is a hugely complicated system. So if you think about a normal braking system where you've got things like a master cylinder, etc., forget all that. The brake-by-wire doesn't have a master cylinder, it doesn't have a vacuum, it doesn't have all those kind of more fundamental elements of braking that you would think of. Those have been removed and replaced with electronic elements. So there isn't as so much pressure being put on the brake pedal as it is as a sensor measuring the travel of the pedal. Much like they do the same with the throttle pedal as well now, where they're not so much in Formula E, but it's happening in road cars a lot as well, where there isn't a connection between any of your pedals and anything in the car. It's all done electronically, where the travel of the pedal is measured and the electronics then feed that into the necessary systems. So we talk about it in Formula One. There's no actual connection between the rear brakes and the brake pedal itself. There still is for the front because that's still like a normal braking system. Because all the regen happens at the rear of the car, that's where the brake-by-wire system happens. So what it's basically doing is there's a the little computer in the car that's working out how much pressure, how much regen, what brake bias you should have for this particular corner to keep everything good, to keep the braking good, to keep the efficiency up, to keep the regen up, but the battery temperatures low. And that's what the algorithm is trying to work out at any given. Every time you hit the brake pedal, it's trying to work out on all those different systems. Whereas before, the driver had to work that out manually and manually do the brake bias and manually do the regen and stuff like that. Whereas now it's just all handled by a computer. So the system itself is vastly complex, but for the driver, it's a lot more simple.
All right, well, now you've made me curious. If we are talking about brake bias, is that no longer something the driver can control? They can't roll front bias or rear bias corner to corner as they previously did. It's set automatically by an algorithm based on the track characteristics?
You probably still override it, but it will want to do its own thing as well.
Okay, and the second thing, and this is like I get for the throttle, it's how much travel is a percentage, but in braking, isn't the force applied a part of what that sensor measures, or is it strictly just travel? Because if it's strictly just travel, that makes it actually, I think, a bit trickier than one would have with a standard road car.
So I know it is the way on some road cars that it does just measure the travel. In racing cars, it might still be different. But because I was actually reading into this a lot more after Marrakesh, because people kept asking me about it, and they, oh man, I should go more in detail about it. So I really threw myself in to the brake-by-wire stuff. And then when I came out, I'm like, man, I should really ask a driver about that. But I haven't seen any around since I came back from Marrakesh. So hopefully, next time I'm at a race, I will spend 10 minutes just talking to somebody about brake-by-wire and how it actually feels from inside the car. But the long and the short of it is that it's just a computer that does the driver's job for them now in terms of working out regen and stuff like that.
Okay, so if I'm understanding it correctly, and this is based on coming from Formula One, the biggest challenge for brake-by-wire, and now I happen to drive a hybrid car maybe 6 or 7 years ago. I believe it was a Honda. It was one of those. It was like a Toyota Prius. And when it was in regen mode, and I stepped on the brake, it was like you were in a manual car, downshifted and just dropped the clutch. You got that much engine deceleration on top of your regular braking, and it drove me nuts because you would brake and then all of a sudden you'd be like, vroom, like you dropped the clutch, and it was totally unpredictable. So, as I understand it from Formula One, what they're after is to recreate a standard pedal feel, regardless of how much braking is being done by brake pads and how much braking is being done by using the axle for regen, which involves what? Running the motor backwards to create resistance or something like that.
Effectively, yeah. The big thing with the aim for brake by wire is to give the driver a consistent pedal feel. Whereas, of course, if you're changing the bias and everything corner by corner as you were beforehand, you were getting a different feel from the brakes every single corner. And that's why we saw so many mistakes, so many lockups, so many spins, and stuff like that. Whereas now the pedal is very consistent and the driver can, just he knows what to expect every time he stamps on the pedal.
Yeah, because to me, the fascinating thing is how they balance the physical slowing of the wheels with the pads versus using the motors to regen the battery. I mean, that's really what we're talking about here. That used to be something the driver did manually. Now, basically, they have big tables of numbers that do that job for them automatically.
If we're talking, yes, by the way, if we're talking really technically, once the regen kicks in, you don't really use the brakes to slow the car down. You just use the regen, which is still on a manual paddle, by the way, behind the steering wheel. So so the regen kicks in at 85% state of charge left in the battery. So you start your race at probably 98%, if we're being honest, because it leaves the garage at 100%. By the time you get to the proper grid, you're at 98%. And this is interesting, right? So this is where teams have been getting quite creative. They had to introduce a rule this year of a minimum state of charge you had to start the race on, which is 97%, if I remember rightly. Because teams worked out, hey, if we start the race at 95% battery, then we'll hit the regen earlier and we can go quicker. That sounds really counterintuitive to take energy out of the car, because that would mean you'd have to drive more efficiently in the race. But it means you're hitting the regen earlier, which is actually better. So they had to implement the rule. You have to start with 97%. And this is where so many teams have been getting penalties for it. This is actually related to a lot of fines and penalties that people have been getting in practice sessions, because the state of charge of the battery is not actually what is being read out on the readouts and on the sensors and stuff like that. Now that's usually just a glitch in the software and things go wrong. But teams have been trying to kind of trick the system a little bit and start the race on as little energy as possible to actually get the regen earlier. But to the point I was going to make, yeah, you don't really use the brakes once you start regenning. So you actually slow the car down using the regen pedal.
Yeah, well, essentially by you slowing the axles directly rather than slowing the discs in the wheels. And it's always been a balancing act. And I say balancing because I know you say you use nothing but regen, but the amount of regeneration you can use is limited by how hot that battery gets. So one presumes at a certain point, as you begin to approach maximum temperature for the battery, you're going to have to ask those pads to go back and do some extra work so you don't overheat and lose performance.
Exactly. The more you regen, the more temperature you're putting into the battery. It's like when you charge your mobile phone. It gets hot, right? It's the same with a Formula E battery, because it's exactly the same concept.
Yes, well, I love me a good technical discussion. So our last listener on Twitter has asked the following incredibly technical question, which I presume you know the answer to in its entirety, which is, can we get a technical rundown on each team? Are there any teams left using anything other than a final drive or a single-speed gearbox?
No, they're all running single-speed gearboxes this season. It was one of the big shocks I got when I was at testing, actually. I was listening out for the gear changes, for the rattling of the box when they came into the pits, nothing. And having taken a peek at some of them as well. No teams are running a two-speed or a three-speed, all single-speed gearboxes. I think there might still be debate as to how many motors some teams are running, Nissan in particular. Although the more I think about it, the less convinced I am that they do actually have a twin motor setup. But we'll find out. But so far, yeah, they're really the only team that are even rumored to be doing something different to what most of the teams are doing. I think next season we'll see something different. Everyone's kind of gone for the single speed gearbox to keep the weight down more than anything. Whereas as they get more comfortable with the new Gen 2 car, you might see them divert a little bit more next season.
I don't know. Convergence is a thing, and it would have to be. I can't imagine the efficiencies you'd have to generate to make the weight penalty worth it, to be honest with you.
Well, Javier Massillon Pinot, somebody always yells at me about how I pronounce that name, who's head of performance at DS Automobiles. He is unconvinced that the single speed solution is the most efficient. He definitely agrees it's the best for the weight. But he thinks that maybe running a 2-speed is better. When I spoke to him, anyway. So I think there could still be changes from team to team.
Yeah, but the efficiencies would have to more than make up for the weight and balance penalty, and that's what I'm seeing right now. Is the state of the art is that they might be slightly more efficient, but are not enough to justify the extra weight and the loss of ballast.
Well, that's something we're going to find out, and something that DS seem to be looking at for the future.
Yes, well, I hope they crack it. It would be fun to have a different and novel technological solution that was competitive, because that's always something that we enjoy seeing. Now, he asks some other questions, and I'm going to do this thing where I say he asked about what kind of algorithm was being used, but he didn't specify in regards to what. So if you feel like clarifying that, please, by all means, hit us up once again on Twitter. And I know he also asked about things like ABB's DTC technology, which is direct torque control, because I'm sure everybody knows it, but I'll say it out loud to make myself sound smart. And we don't really know, do we?
No, it sounds an awful lot like traction control to me, which is banned in Formula E. But the fact that it's something that ABB makes, which of course is the title sponsor of Formula E, makes me think that it might actually be something more fundamental in the car. So, I guess I'll find out more about it. In terms of the algorithm, I'm assuming that's maybe something related to the brake-by-wire, which of course only 2 teams have developed. And everyone else has got theirs from a Formula One or an LMP1 team. So that could be. I hope that answers your question a little bit better, Matthew.
Well, if not, do feel free to specify and clarify, and we can give Steven some homework, because honestly, he just sits around and plays on his own entirely too much.
Plays on my phone, getting you answers to questions that you will ask.
Can you tell I've been hanging out with my daughter entirely too much? All right. Is there any other business today? Anything else we need to talk about?
I think other than the plugging, let's plug away.
All right. Where can we find you, Mr. Chris_Journo Stevens?
Oh, you can find me on Twitter at cstevens_journo, or my written work at ejournoonline.com. All the Formula E stuff, all the podcasts I do. Go check it out.
Yes, and don't forget, you can find me at MattPT55 on the Twitters. Come and yell at me. Tell me I'm wrong about all of the things. I enjoy every last second of it. And don't forget, you can also catch us on Twitter at eRadio Show. And if you're a part of our Missed Apex Slack group, be sure to join the Formula E channel as well. And remember, chicks dig heels, wounds cause scars, and glory is a fungible concept under certain philosophical precepts. This has been eRadio Show.